There's a room in the Vatican archive that most historians never enter, not because it is sealed, not because it is classified, but because the documents inside it describe things that do not fit comfortably inside the version of Roman history that textbooks have spent 2 centuries building. They describe Roman women, not the women Rome chose to remember, the other ones, the ones who disappear from the official record at the exact moment they become inconvenient, the ones whose names appear in court documents and property records and funeral inscriptions, and then simply stop. No death recorded, no exile recorded, no explanation offered, just absence. And in Rome, when a woman's name stops appearing in the record without explanation, that silence is not accidental. That silence was the point. There is a version of Roman women that everyone knows. The noble matron sitting at her loom, the devoted wife managing her husband's household with quiet efficiency, the grieving mother sending her sons off to war with pride rather than tears. Rome built that image deliberately, over centuries, through literature and law and public ceremony, and it is so complete, so consistent, so carefully maintained that most people who study Roman history today still use it as their primary frame of reference without realizing what it was designed to conceal. Because on the other side of that image, just behind the loom and the household accounts and the public ceremony, was a reality so different from the official version that Rome spent 400 years making sure it would never be fully recovered. It almost succeeded. Rome classified its women into legal categories before it classified them as people. A Roman woman was, under the oldest layers of Roman law, permanently and completely under the authority of a male guardian. As a child, she belonged to her father. As a wife, she belonged to her husband. As a widow, she belonged to her husband's male relatives, or to a guardian appointed by the state. She could not appear in court on her own behalf. She could not sign a contract without male authorization. She could not make a will, conduct business, or manage property without a man standing beside her to make the transaction legally real. The law did not treat this as a limitation. The law treated this as the natural order. Gaius, one of Rome's most important legal writers, explained it plainly in the 2nd century CE. Women, he wrote, are kept in guardianship on account of their levity of mind. Not cruelty, not malice, simply the calm institutional assumption that women's minds were constitutionally unequal to the weight of legal decision. And that assumption was written into every layer of Roman society so completely that even women who accumulated significant wealth, significant influence, and significant political power were required to route that power through the men who legally owned them. The wealth was real, the influence was real, the power was real. The woman exercising it was, in the eyes of Roman law, not quite.
But that's not what makes this disturbing. What makes this disturbing is what happened to the women who pushed against that structure. Because they existed. They always existed. In every generation of Roman history, there were women who found the edges of what the law permitted and pressed against them. Women who conducted business through carefully constructed legal fictions. Women who accumulated property across generations by exploiting the narrow gaps in guardianship law. Women who built political networks through the marriages of their children and the management of their households. Who influenced elections and military appointments and provincial governorships through relationships that Rome's official history recorded as merely personal. These women were not rare. They were not exceptional. They were a permanent feature of Roman society that the official records systematically declined to document as what it actually was. And the ones who became too visible, the ones whose power grew large enough that it could no longer be processed through the fiction of male authority, those are the ones whose names stop appearing in the record without explanation. Sempronia is one of the earliest. She was the wife of a consul, educated in Greek and Latin literature, capable of writing poetry and playing musical instruments and holding conversations about philosophy that her male contemporaries found impressive enough to record, which is itself an indication of how unusual they considered it. The historian Sallust described her intelligence in terms that were clearly meant as condemnation. She had done many deeds of masculine audacity, he wrote. She was too clever, too present, too unwilling to occupy only the space Rome had assigned her. Sallust recorded her involvement in the Catilinarian conspiracy of 63 BCE, and then she disappears from the historical record entirely. No trial recorded, no exile recorded, no death recorded. Just absence. Historians today do not know what happened to Sempronia after 63 BCE. The record simply stops. Fulvia was the wife of Mark Antony, which means her name survived because his name survived. But what Rome recorded about Fulvia is careful, deliberate, and revealing in what it emphasizes. She commanded troops. This is not disputed by ancient sources. During the Perusian War of 41 BCE, Fulvia personally directed military operations in Italy while her husband was occupied in the east. She made strategic decisions. She negotiated with generals. She issued orders that were followed. The ancient sources that describe this are unanimous on the basic facts. Where they diverge is in how they interpret those facts. Cicero, who despised her, described her military activity as evidence of her unwomanliness. Velleius Paterculus called her a woman in nothing except her body. The coins minted during this period, which bear her image, the first living Roman woman ever to appear on Roman coinage, were melted down and reminted after her death in 40 BCE. The official version of the period that followed was constructed largely by her enemies, and in that version, Fulvia's military command is a source of embarrassment rather than documentation. She had done something that Rome's categories had no legitimate place for, so Rome placed it in the category of disorder, of excess, of the chaos that happens when women step outside their assigned roles, and then moved on.
This is where the story changes, because the erasure of Roman women from the historical record was not a passive process. It was not simply that male historians chose to write about men rather than women, though they did. It was not simply that women's lives were considered less historically significant, though that assumption was everywhere. The erasure of specific women, women who had accumulated real power, real influence, real documented presence in Roman political and military life, was an active process. It involved the destruction of documents, the removal of names from public inscriptions, the rewriting of family histories to route achievements through male relatives rather than the women who had actually produced them. Rome had a specific legal mechanism for the most extreme version of this process. It was called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Officially, it was applied to disgraced emperors and senior officials. Their names were removed from inscriptions, their statues destroyed or recarved with different faces, their existence expunged from the official record as completely as the physical limitations of stone and bronze allowed. What historians rarely discuss is how often an informal version of this process was applied to women who had never been officially condemned at all, women whose names simply stopped appearing, women whose property records show a male relative suddenly administering an estate that a woman had built over decades, women whose correspondence survives only in the letters of the men who received it, stripped of context, stripped of attribution, stripped of everything that would have made clear who had actually written it. Hortensia is one of the clearest cases. In 42 BCE, when the Second Triumvirate imposed a tax on Rome's wealthiest women to fund their military campaigns, Hortensia stood up in the Roman Forum and delivered a speech opposing the tax directly to the triumvirs. This is documented. The speech was recorded. Ancient sources confirm that it was effective. The number of women subject to the tax was reduced after her intervention. Hortensia's speech survived in a version attributed to the rhetorician Quintilian, who described it as worth reading even by his own era's standards. And then, Hortensia disappears from the record. She had demonstrated, publicly and effectively, that a Roman woman could exercise political influence through her own voice rather than through the men who legally managed her affairs. Rome recorded the moment. Rome did not record what happened to Hortensia afterward. The documentation ends precisely where it becomes most interesting. What matters is not any single case. What matters is the pattern. Because when you look at the historical record across the full span of Roman history, not through the official framework that modern scholarship inherited from Rome's own historians, but through the legal documents and property records and funeral inscriptions and private correspondence that survived despite rather than because of Rome's institutional preferences, a different picture emerges. A picture of women who built and managed significant economic enterprises across multiple generations. Women who operated as the real administrative centers of large households that functioned, in practice, as economic and political units of considerable power. Women who created and maintained the networks of obligation and relationship that Roman political life actually ran on, while the men those networks connected stood in the forum and took credit for the connections. Women who educated their children, and in many cases their children's children and the children of allied families, in the rhetorical and philosophical traditions that shaped Roman public life, without ever being permitted to participate in that public life directly themselves. And women who, when those contributions became too visible, too documented, too impossible to route through the standard fictions of male authority, found their names beginning to disappear from the very records they had created.
The women of the Julio-Claudian dynasty are the best documented example because the political stakes were high enough that multiple sources recorded the same events from different angles, which makes the gaps in the record visible in a way they usually are not. Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, managed a correspondence network that her stepson Tiberius later described as encompassing essentially every significant figure in the Roman world. She administered her own estates, which were substantial. She maintained her own staff of skilled workers whose products, including a particular variety of wheat named after her, were traded commercially across the empire. Augustus, in his will, gave her the title of Augusta and adopted her into the Julian family, giving her a status with no legal precedent. And when she died in 29 CE, Tiberius, who had spent decades managing the political consequences of her influence while publicly acknowledging almost none of it, refused to allow the honors that the Senate had voted her. He delayed her funeral. He prevented the construction of the arch the Senate had approved. He ensured that the public record of her death was as minimal as the public record of her life had been carefully managed. What she had actually done for 45 years of Roman political history was not recorded by anyone who had full access to the documentation. The documentation itself was managed as carefully in death as her influence had been managed in life. Agrippina the Elder survived her husband Germanicus, who was Rome's most celebrated general of his generation, and then spent the following decade being systematically destroyed by Tiberius, who understood correctly that her presence in Rome was a continuous political problem. She was the granddaughter of Augustus. She had accompanied Germanicus on his military campaigns. Soldiers who had served under Germanicus were personally loyal to her in a way that had no proper legal category. She spoke publicly on multiple occasions in ways that made clear she believed her own political judgment was equal to the men who were nominally managing the affairs she was directly involved in. Tiberius had her arrested in 29 CE on charges that the ancient sources treat with unconcealed skepticism. She was exiled to the island of Pandateria, the same island where Augustus had sent her mother Julia 30 years earlier, and died there in 33 CE. The official cause of death was starvation. Whether that starvation was chosen or imposed is a question the ancient sources approach very carefully and never quite answered directly. This is what the erasure of Roman women actually looked like in practice. Not a single dramatic moment of destruction, not a decree or a bonfire or a public ceremony of condemnation. A slow, methodical, institutionally supported process of making powerful women's contributions invisible by routing them through men, of making dangerous women disappear by applying legal mechanisms that generated minimal documentation, of ensuring that the version of events that survived in the historical record was the version that Rome's institutional interests required, rather than the version that the women involved would have recognized. It worked. For 1,500 years, it worked so completely that the study of Roman women was considered a marginal historical interest, a supplement to the real history, rather than a missing half of it. The documents that survived, the wills, the property records, the private letters, the funeral inscriptions that families commissioned before the official version of a woman's life could be standardized, were scattered across archives in Rome and Naples and the Vatican and smaller collections throughout Europe, uncatalogued, untranslated, unread by anyone looking for the history they contained.
The scholars who began systematically recovering that history in the late 20th century, working through legal papyri from Roman Egypt, through business records from Pompeii that the eruption of Vesuvius had preserved before Rome's official processes could reach them, through the private correspondence of families that had survived in church archives without anyone recognizing its significance, found a Roman world that looked substantially different from the official version. They found women operating as the primary economic managers of large agricultural estates. They found women conducting commercial transactions of significant scale through legal mechanisms that technically required male authorization, but in practice ran entirely on their own judgment and relationships. They found women whose letters demonstrate a level of political awareness and strategic thinking that their male correspondents clearly took seriously, even as the public record pretended those conversations were not happening. They found, in the Pompeii business records alone, evidence of a female commercial network operating across the town that had been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years because the historians who examined those records had been looking for the kinds of activity that Rome's official categories said women performed, and had simply not recognized the kinds of activity that Roman women actually performed. Rome built an image of its women that was so complete, so internally consistent, and so beautifully suited to Rome's institutional needs that it survived the fall of the empire, the conversion to Christianity, the medieval period, the Renaissance, and the first 2 centuries of modern historical scholarship essentially intact. The noble matron at her loom, the devoted wife, the grieving mother. That image is not false exactly. There were Roman women who lived lives that the image describes accurately, but it was never the whole picture. It was the picture Rome needed the world to have. And the women who did not fit inside it, the women who built things and commanded things and argued things and refused things and disappeared from the record at precisely the moment their visibility became a problem, those women were the part of Roman history that Rome worked hardest to make sure would never be recovered. Some of their names came back: Sempronia, Fulvia, Hortensia, Livia, Agrippina. Names that survived because the political stakes surrounding them were high enough that multiple sources recorded the same events, which made the gaps visible. But for every name that survived, there are dozens that did not. Women whose property records show a sudden transfer to a male relative with no explanation. Women whose names appear in one document and then stop. Women whose contributions to the households and networks and enterprises that Roman public life ran on were so thoroughly routed through the men who legally owned them that the women themselves became invisible, even in the documentation they had created. They are in the record, they are simply not in the record as themselves. They are in the record as the unnamed background of their husbands' achievements, as the unattributed source of their sons' educations, as the invisible architects of the relationships that their brothers and fathers used to build careers that Rome's official history recorded without ever explaining where the foundation came from. The truth about Roman women is not that Rome was uniquely cruel to them. Every ancient civilization operated within structures that modern people would recognize as unjust. The truth is that Rome built those structures with such legal precision, such institutional thoroughness, and such careful attention to the management of the historical record that the women who lived inside those structures, who found ways to exercise power and build things and leave marks on the world despite everything those structures were designed to prevent, were erased from history not by accident, not by neglect, but by a process that was as deliberate and as carefully maintained as the aqueducts and the roads and the legal frameworks that the textbooks still hold up as Rome's great gifts to civilization. The aqueducts carried water, the roads carried armies, and the legal frameworks carried, built into their foundations, a mechanism for making half the population's contributions to Roman life systematically invisible. That mechanism worked for 2,000 years. It is still working in the version of Roman history that most people learn. And the women it erased were real. Their names are beginning to come back, but the record of what they actually did, the full record, the record Rome worked so hard to prevent from existing, is still mostly gone, buried under 15 centuries of the version Rome preferred. waiting in archives that no one has finished reading, present in gaps that most historians have not yet learned to recognize as the evidence they are. If this story changed how you see Rome, subscribe, because the history we were taught was never the whole story. Tell us in the comments, does it change how you see Roman civilization, knowing that half of it was deliberately erased?